I would just start my presentation.
When you are hungry and malnourished,
they need dream and want tomorrow on destitution and hunger.
Because you are not keeping the nutrition norm constant.
Now I am sure, ladies and gentlemen, if you scratch your head, you will
Finance
realize
Minister of the company absented himself from the parliament.
though I may not be saying anything very new, you by dint of your work and I by dint of mine, we have seen possibly the worst of all circumstances that are present in our society, the worst situations, we've heard about the worst stories. So really what is there to speak of? But there are still nuances that because of our collective experience, direct experience, we feel can enhance our understanding of law and policy, but don't often get there, don't often make it. Secondly, when we have seen it all and heard it all, there is a certain loss of urgency and a certain loss of hope, and it's very, very important for me to sustain this by conversations like this. So I beg your indulgence. I also promise you that the word law probably does not creep into my presentation at all. See, one thing that is not very well understood is that when we speak of child deaths, child health, child nourishment, child illness, child morbidity, child mortality, we probably tend to look at it from the point of view of health or from the point of view of on humanitarian grounds, but it's not sufficiently understood that as an index of development, it is the index of development of comprehensively of that whole socio-economic system that we are talking about, and this is internationally understood. If you look at development indices or indices of poverty on the whole, we find that infant mortality and very especially the under 5 child mortality rate, this is one of the mainstays of measuring development for any country, not just for children, but for any country. And the reason behind that is that it's linked so very sturdily with everything that's going on in a society in terms of its socioeconomics. So what are the factors that go into an under 5 child mortality? Why under 5? Why child mortality? Why not adult mortality? Why not over 5? I think it's quite evident that these are the most vulnerable people in any society and most sensitive to changes in or detriments in the socio-economic situation. And that's why this has been used as a major index. The under 5 child mortality rate has been used as a major index for development on the whole. So, yeah. So this is what it's all linked to: employments and livelihoods, gender equity, the availability and distribution of food, water, sanitation, healthcare services, environment, literacy, education. Just about every issue you can think of has its impact on and links with under 5 child mortality in a kind of two-way system. It not only does it impact under 5 child mortality also impacts each of these issues in turn, and it's very important to see how that happens. Next one, please. But what is the situation for our country? I mean, as individual Indians, we know that there's a very high premium on children amongst us, in our families, in our society, but as a country, we really have a dismal track record in terms of these development indices. And next slide, please. I'm not going to go into data. I think the previous speaker was quite correct. Data tends to dehumanize. It's only with a view to create that urgency, that sense of urgency I was talking about, that I'm presenting a little bit without references. I hope you'll trust me. This is all generally government data. 1 in 3 children are born underweight. This really means that they're already born disabled. And born underweight is born less than 2.5 kilograms or even far less than that. Born already vulnerable to dying, to disease, to not growing up as well as other children would. And a lot of this has, of course, relationship to the socioeconomic situation within which they're born. 1 in 2 children are underweight, half our population. 1 in 2 children are stunted. Stunted means they're shorter than they should have been. And 3 in 4 are anemic or short of blood, which makes them, again, vulnerable to disease, to infection, to not doing as well, to not being able to run around without panting, to not have headaches, to be able to go to school just as well. And this is 1 in 2 of average Indian statistics. So what does that mean for poor people? If you subtract from this middle class, middle class, upper middle class, and the elite, you'd left with practically 100% in poor populations. So even this 1 in 2 is really fallacious, which means that an entire section of our country is completely different from another entire section of children. This is what really these statistics show. Next slide, please. And I think it would surprise many of you to know that we have twice as many chronically hungry children than sub-Saharan Africa. I think all of us remember those visions on television of these very, very frail, very completely shrunken skin and bone, children who are being held to the breast of a completely wasted breast. We've seen all this happening from Ethiopia and all that. And this is sub-Saharan Africa. Our hearts bled for it. We even contributed as a country and as individuals to that whole crisis. But this is the continuous crisis in our own country, right in our backyard, literally. And it's been continuing for just centuries, and it's still this is the situation. Next slide, please. And how does this translate? What we were saying before, that you have a section of our population which is born already in a situation of disability, because their growth, their development, their cognition, their ability to learn, the growth of their brain, for example, which we know grows fastest, all growth really happens exponentially in the first 3 years of life. And it sets the stage for the entire growth of personality, of your body and your brain, your psyche for the rest of your life. So really it's a very critical period, and this is already disadvantaged from birth. Disease, the vicious cycle with disease, when you're malnourished, when you are hungry and malnourished, your immune system obviously can't cope as well with just very ordinary diseases. Diseases like measles, for example, very, very ordinary disease, but it's a killer in the situation of malnutrition. Diseases like tuberculosis, again a killer in the situation of malnutrition. But if you and I were to get measles, or our children were to get measles, we'd probably not suffer terribly. But for a malnourished child who gets a disease, then by dint of the disease they get further malnourished, and then they get further diseased, then further malnourished, and it's a downward spiral to death. The same figure, that's how we arrive at that very, very large figure of mortality. Then links, this is a new kind of thing, links with chronic disease. Suddenly we are all very, very aware of diseases to do with the heart diseases, hypertension, diabetes. These are the so-called elite diseases, but they're not really so, and the links to being born low birth weight are now very, very strong in terms of recent research. Of course, financial implications of the whole thing, unnecessary costs on healthcare. This is, I think, a chronic story in our country, that we always putting the fire out instead of preventing it from starting in the first place. We're spending a lot of money on a lot of technological interventions rather than looking at public health expenditure for prevention. Just simple things like food, water, sanitation, that we're not able to do at all with any great degree of success. Yet we will immunize against waterborne diseases, spend a lot of money doing that. Not bad in itself, but it's really a reversal of the kind of process that we should be following in the first place. And loss of overall productivity. Links with fertility rates I'm bringing up only for the reason that demographic data, population control, these are things that seem very, very important in today's discourse. So important that human rights sometimes take a backseat vis-a-vis this argument. So let us just say that when we protect our children from dying and from morbidity and mortality, it's automatic that fertility rates come down. This we've seen in our own country. We've seen it in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, whose fertility rates are now approaching, Kerala always did, but the other two also, fertility rates coming down under 2, which means every family having 2 children maximum. We've seen this in other countries, Scandinavian countries. It's absolutely self-evident. When we look after our children, people produce less children. And it is a matter of national shame, and I say sorrow. National shame, why? Because we are hauled up continuously in front of international organizations. Now, what is the right to food for a newborn child? We find in our work that it's very difficult to get people to understand this. When a child is born, a child is meant to have exclusive breastfeeding for a period of 6 months. Only breast milk for a period of 6 months. That is its right to food. It cannot come from a PDS shop, it cannot come from an ICDS, it cannot come from a midday meal. It can only come from proximity to the mother. And the mother, in this case, we're talking about a poor working woman. All poor women are working women. Whether they work for wages or they do not work for wages, they are working women. Their working hours are from like 18 to 20 hours a day sometimes. Sometimes they leave their child of 4 weeks age or few days age, and they have to go for wage work. And as the medical community or health community, this has become a very huge message to give poor women, you must breastfeed, you must breastfeed. But what is the state support for this? State or family support even for this? If you compute the hours required to breastfeed a child, if we say that every child needs to feed every 3 hours, for example, and every breastfeeding would, I'm just going into this because I really want to explain what it means in terms of women's work and women's labor. It means it comes to a total of 4 hours a day for just to breastfeed, which is over and above what she needs to bathe a child, to clean a child, to do all her other housework, etc. 4 hours a day just for the child to realize its right to food under Article 21, etc. And where is this going to come from, and what is the situation which supports this right to food for this child? This comes from maternity entitlements, which are practically non-existent in the unorganized sector in our country. I mean, completely so, though the NMBS does figure in the list of 8 schemes that we're talking about. And this comes from the presence of creches on work sites, again in the unorganized sector, practically a non-existent situation. Then 6 months to 3 years, which is the period that's covered, even under the ICDS, potentially covered, but not actually so, as we will hear from subsequent speakers. These are the years which are decisive for malnutrition to set in and to be established. So therefore, also the years for malnutrition to be prevented. This is the time where malnutrition must be prevented. Therefore, the importance of systems such as the ICDS, and for making it work for children under 2, for which it is notoriously not good. Next slide, please. So why does it happen? Poverty and gender. Poverty I'm not going to speak about. Gender, again, just to reinforce that this aspect of women's work and women's labor and women's time is very important to the whole issue of child malnutrition. Even in an older child, to be able to make the food available, to make it appropriately, to spend the time feeding a child. We all know how long it takes to feed a child of 2. All this requires changes in law and policy, believe me. It's not something that's just to be left for within the family and intra-familial kind of situation. This does require a lot of support from society and from the state. Next. Now just very quickly, special case for the urban poor child. Why? Because I've spent about 11 years of my life dealing directly with urban poor children. And I really feel that this is an aspect that's not given sufficient thought to. Well, rural child does figure in our discourse, but the urban child is often left out, considered to be rich enough to fend for themselves, discriminated in various schemes and policies. Now, we know that the urban poor, they have migrated and they are largely dispossessed. So they would be the worst off amongst the rural poor, are often, those are the ones who migrate into cities. The push and pull factors we're all aware of. They lose their traditional systems of care. Their children lose their traditional care systems. They come here, both parents work. Women's work is markedly different from her work in rural areas. She works much more for wages. She works much more for distances which are further from her home. She works much more in situations which are much less secure and much less in her control. And therefore, children's nutrition, as we've tried to show before the link, is definitely hampered. And the cash crunch. Now, these families, they don't come under the category of BPL. They will not be able to survive in a city if they're earning less than 1,500 rupees. They might be earning 3,000 or 4,000 rupees, but they have to buy everything for cash. And since they do not fall under the category of BPL, they don't get any special interventions, and schemes also do not apply to them, which would have applied for the rural poor. And the child is definitely disadvantaged. The physical environment is very poor, overcrowding. They come face to face with the completely different end of the spectrum. The richest of the rich are what they confront, and their aspirations are also guided by what they see in terms of their feeding habits, in terms of psychology, in terms of what they want. If you tell a child, no, drink milk, don't drink Coke, whereas my child is okay to drink Coke because it's not going to do that child so much harm. It's just not good enough, because they see it from day to day, they see it every day, and they follow the same systems. They will eat junk food, they will drink Coke, they will want the money to be able to do all that. It's just not good enough to say to them, when you have money, spend it on vegetables, the same money, because it won't work. They will buy junk food with that money. Next. Just again, quick data. Consumption of energy and nutrients in urban slums comparable to rural landless. This is just to reinforce the fact that they are actually extremely poor, in an extremely bad situation. Again, previous speaker did mention that you speak of one beggar who earns 1,000 rupees a day, but you don't speak of those, I don't know, millions who are, I mean, think of it, why would anybody want to stand at a crossroads in burning heat and earn a few pennies here and there and be kicked around and also be abused? It's exactly the same situation in slums. When we advocate for children in slums, what we are told is that you don't know, they're very rich, they have very large bank accounts, they have Mercedes cars, they hire out their juggies. Now that may be true for one or two, but in the large situation, I think this is not our studies or government statistics. Next one. And again, all this slide shows is that slum children are worse off than rural children, which is not to say discriminate against a rural child. We should not be fighting child against child, but it is to say that urban poverty must get its due consideration. Next. These are all statistics which are published in Indian Pediatrics, a pediatrics journal, quite recent, 2004, and they tell you data from various cities. There's Baroda, there's Delhi, there's Banaras. Next one. Chandigarh, Delhi, Lucknow. You know, these are some of these cities. They claim not even to have slums. Officially, there are no statistics that there are even slums there. Srinagar, Kolkata, Bhopal, all across the country, they're showing very, very poor statistics. 63%, 75%, 80%, 90%. Like we said, if we take away the middle class from our statistics, we'd be left with something to the tune between 80 and 100%. All children. Next. Yeah, more cities, Delhi, Calcutta, Jawaharlal. Now, specific interventions, I think we must look at situations of intrafamilial food distribution, not something that perhaps lawmakers can do much about, but it's something to keep in mind when you, because I don't agree, I think it was a very humble position taken by the last speaker that judges don't play a role in making policy. I think definitely a lot of policy work in our countries happen through judicial intervention. Antenatal care, these are all health interventions that are well understood. People are trying to take care of these things. Maternity entitlement is a very big gap area. Childcare services, another very big gap area, all related to labor, situation of labor and women. PDS, ICDS won't say much about healthcare services and water. Next slide. I just want to leave you with this, that all this is preventable. This entire humanitarian crisis and urgent situation, terribly sad situation, all these figures which to us translate in actual faces with names, whose families have grieved in front of us, who feel helpless. You know, again, let's not dehumanize the statistics that we see, 1 in 2, 1 in 3, 3 in 4. These are all real children who have died. And thank you for your patience.
I would just start my presentation.
When you are hungry and malnourished,
They mean dream and one tomorrow on destitution and hunger.
because you are not keeping the nutrition norm constant.
Now I am sure, ladies and gentlemen, if you scratch your head, you will
Finance
realize
Minister of the country absented himself from the parliament.
I'd like to say a few words about how the PUCL case began in 2001. I remember we had visited Jaipur for a meeting on prison reform, and Professor Jean Drèze, the architect of the Employment Guarantee Act, which has just been passed by Parliament, suggested that we visit some of the villages of Jaipur. 5 kilometers outside Jaipur city, we saw the FCI godowns with grain so overflowing. The grain was kept outside the godowns, and the water had, the rain had fermented the grain and it was rotting. And 5 kilometers from that godown where grain was in abundance, we saw a village where people were eating in rotation, what is classically called rotation eating, rotation hunger, where some members of the family eat on one day and the remaining persons eat on the other day. And on that simple basis, namely that there was 60 million tons, this was 2001, 2002, 60 million tons of grain in the Food Corporation of India godowns. The buffer stock required was 20 million tons. Government had 40 million tons above the buffer stock, and people were dying of starvation in the country. There were reports all over the country. On that simple proposition, the PUCL in Rajasthan filed a case which came to the Supreme Court. I remember telling Kavita Srivastav, Kavita, don't tell anyone about the case, it's likely to be dismissed. We don't know what response may come from judges. Because in 1989, when Utsa Patnaik filed his case, the case which Justice Sri Krishna referred to, Utsa Patnaik's case was met by the state of Orissa, by a reply of the state of Orissa which said that yes, there is starvation, yes, there is hunger, but the state of Orissa is committed fully committed to the eradication of hunger, and we promise to take all possible steps to eradicate hunger in our state. This was 1989. And believing the state of Orissa, the Supreme Court said the state of Orissa has given us assurances. We have absolutely no reason to disbelieve what the state has said, and we hope and trust that the state of Orissa will take all possible steps to eradicate hunger. This was 1989. Case was disposed of very quickly on that basis. And from 1989 onwards, Orissa had a distinction of having upwards of 100 starvation deaths reported every year. And God knows how many actually people died. Our case came in 2001, and I remember when it came before Justice Kirpal, he said his first reaction was, Chief Justice Kirpal's first reaction, how can this be? This cannot be allowed. And on questioning, when he issued notice and the Attorney General appeared, then Mr. Soli Sorabji, he asked Mr. Sorabji, how can we allow hunger like this to be in our country when there's so much of grain available? Mr. Sorabji was very, very helpful, very positive. It wasn't adversarial in that sense. In fact, many of Mr. Sorabji's interventions helped us. Often he carried the case more than the petitioner's advocate carrying the case. It was Mr. Sorabji and his perspective of things that helped us. But I remember at one stage when Mr. Sorabji said, we don't have the money to give everybody all the things that the petitioner wants. He wants employment, he wants the midday meal scheme, he wants the ICDS scheme, he wants employment guarantee, he wants everything. We don't have the money. And I remember being prepared with all the judgments from the Ratlam municipality case downwards, which said that when it comes to the enforcement of a fundamental right, the courts will not entertain a plea that the state has no finances. I remember that judgment, I kept it ready. But Justice Kirpal cut us short and said one sentence, cut the flab somewhere else. And he looked at Mr. Sorabji and said, Mr. Sorabji, either you do it or we'll tell you how to do it. And that ended a whole line of possible arguments that people often do in courts, that we have no money to do this. The PUCL case is perhaps taken for granted in our country because public interest litigation is common. It is common to have the courts do extraordinary things, the high courts particularly and the Supreme Court as well, extraordinary things through the mechanism of the PIL. It flows from the nature of the Indian Constitution, a very vibrant piece of legislation, but it also flows from judge-made law. But abroad, judges are astonished by what they read, absolutely astonished. They cannot believe that a court will look into the nitty-gritty of hunger like the Supreme Court has done. They cannot understand how you have a system of commissioners where the commissioners get evidence instead of the petitioner getting evidence. They cannot imagine how a case can go on in the Supreme Court for 4 years and 5 years and 6 years, or in a high court for so many years. The idea of a continuing mandamus is something they just can't understand. I remember 6 months ago at Helsinki in Finland, where the judges of the European Court were gathered, and they were discussing constitutional law and the constitutions of countries. And I spoke on the constitution in India and how the courts use the constitution in this dynamic fashion. They were amazed. And of course they have the usual questions, isn't this intruding on the executive? And then of course we must admit that it does to some extent intrude upon the executive, but by necessity perhaps an intrusion takes place. But what does it matter, I say, what does it matter as long as the poor of India get relief from courts? And it is truly something which is historic globally. Not only the right to food case, but also the whole reach of the law and the amazing power of our courts. The power of our judges to do justice is something historic. And the world is slowly, very slowly beginning to understand how powerful that reach is and how wonderful the Indian Constitution is. Perhaps the only other constitution on par with judges on par as well, with the same kind of judges with that thinking, is perhaps the South African court and the South African Constitution. But the Indian judgments on the right to food in particular have made history globally. Now a few words about the presentations as they will come up today. Living in the cities of our country, we see so much food and so much employment, so much wealth, so much luxury, It is sometimes difficult to get beyond the surface and see the reality of our country. But the speakers from Dr. Saxena onwards will show you that India is on the brink of a precipice. There is a crisis of historic proportions, where hunger, malnutrition, starvation, consumption of food is going down so dramatically and on such a large scale, so precipitously, that as Utsa Patnaik will show in her presentation, we are probably reaching levels akin to the levels that existed prior to independence in India. There is an awesome crisis of hunger deepening in our country. So on the one hand, we have the development of wealth and entrepreneurship, globalization. On the other hand, we have very, very deep hunger. As far as children are concerned, you'll hear the presentation by a number of people, including Mr. Harsh Manda, Dr. Vandana Prasad. And you will see how extensive child malnutrition is. And Dr. Prasad, when she speaks, will tell you of the terrible effects of malnutrition on millions of children, with shrunken brains and stunted growth. So that ultimately we will have a whole generation of millions and millions of people, our next generation of Indians, growing up in a sense disabled, not having the full physical and mental capacity to lead a normal life. A frightening scenario of a country with the next generation growing up disabled. We have the first presentation by Dr. Saxena. I'd like to say a few words. He was formerly a member of the Planning Commission, a very senior civil servant. But more than anything else, he has been a champion of the right to food movement. He has traveled extensively. He goes to the villages of India. And it is he who has made the kind of material that we now generate for you possible. Because it's a mass of data coming in from all the states and from the central government. Often the data comes in very funny ways. Much of that data for many years was hidden and kept secret until we opened that box of information, sometimes forcibly, sometimes by persuasion. But that entire mass of data, he's able to make it in a very presentable form so that people can understand what's happening on the right to food. Professor Utsa Patnaik say that if one goes by the calorie intakes, which is 2,400 calories per person per day, a standard accepted in India in 1979, and if one looks at the latest census data, one finds that 70% of the population is at or below the consumption of 2,400 calories per person per day. So if one looks at the calorie line, one finds 70% of the population below the poverty line. So there was an underlying debate yesterday, which we were not able to complete because of the paucity of time, between the official data of 27% is what the government says now. But in the latest statement in the Supreme Court, they've accepted a poverty line of roughly 37%, which is roughly 400 million people below the poverty line. So you have an official acceptance of 400 million people, and you have the latest census data in terms of calorie inputs of roughly 700 million people below that poverty line. But even if one ignores this debate and looks at the Planning Commission's latest statement of 2000-2001 of the poverty line, what is the poverty line? One comes to an amazing chart. I'd like you to have a look at that. It shows a poverty line which India, the Planning Commission in India accepts, which will have Delhi, for example, I think is 531 rupees per person per month. I'll have this slide up for you in a second. And I think Chennai and all the other cities have a similar poverty line of roughly 500 rupees per person per month. Which means in a practical sense that if you have a servant who has 532 rupees per month income, in a city like Delhi, that person will strictly speaking fall outside the poverty line and not be eligible for a BPL card. And it's striking that in the era of globalization, where we speak of the globalization of rights and the globalization of standards, when it comes to the globalization of human rights, there is very little said. The old international poverty line was said to be $1 a day, which is 50 rupees per person. Today people say $2 a day, which is 100 rupees per person, which in Indian terms would be roughly about 3,000 rupees per person per month is what a person would need to get out of poverty or to get out of the poverty line. But in India, the poverty line is, and if you have a look at this, in Andhra Pradesh, the official poverty line is for the urban areas 457 rupees per capita per month. Assam 343, Bihar 379, 474 for Gujarat, Haryana 420, Karnataka 511, Kerala 477, Madhya Pradesh 481. It is truly such a pathetic figure. If you go down please, you'll get Delhi, I think. You'll get the capital city. Delhi of course is 505, West Bengal 409. And that's why, that is the source of Utsa Patnaik's anger, if you like, when she says, how can we even think of a poverty line so low that a person in Delhi getting 506 rupees would not be eligible for a BPL card. And that is the reason why she said, I won't go, I refuse to go by these standards of money, I'll look at calories. And she says, by your own latest data, it shows 70% of the population consuming less than what they ought to consume. So that is, in yesterday's discussion, there's something which missed us. There was a lot of talk on the rural poverty, and P. Sainath, I think, did a very excellent session in the evening. But we missed something in Dr. Vandana Prasad's presentation, which went very quickly by, which was the latest figures showing hunger and malnutrition among children in the cities of India in the year 2004. And that chart you will find in your, we'll circulate it today. That chart showed every city from Baroda onwards, I think 12 or 15 cities of India. And it showed children in slums having nearly an 80 to 85% malnutrition level, with approximately 30% severe malnourishment, that is to say wasting and stunting taking place in children. So the phenomenon of malnutrition is not a rural phenomenon at all, it's very much an urban phenomenon. And several cities have recorded starvation deaths. The city of Bombay, where I came from, I personally recorded after the mills closed. I personally went to Katao mill, for example. After the closure of the Katao mill, we recorded the deaths of 60 workers who died in the age group 35 to 45. And we interviewed the family members, the women in the houses. I went into the chawls and we took films of the women. And they had very sad stories to tell of their husbands leaving early morning because they were ashamed that they could not feed their children, coming back late at night and not telling their wives where they were the whole day, and not eating basically the whole day, or just eating a sandwich or something like that. And the wives described how their husbands lost weight and lost weight and lost weight, and how they took their children out of school to feed their families, and ultimately their husbands got blood pressure, all kinds of side effects. And at the age of 45, the average age of death was 45 for the textile workers, they died. And similar starvation deaths have been reported across the country when textile mills closed and so on. The film that we had was deaths in the West Bengal tea plantations after the closure of the tea plantations. Strangely again linked with pesticides in food. So the international market found pesticides in Indian tea and was blacklisted, and many of the plantations closed. And then we recorded starvation deaths in the plantations of West Bengal. There was a small film that we showed sometime earlier. And in the documentation done, the NGOs report that not a rat is to be found in the plantations of West Bengal, because the West Bengal workers have been reduced to eating rats. And I remember the minister, when he was confronted with this, said, what is there? In India people eat snakes, people eat birds. What is there for people to eat rats? So that was the response to the starvation deaths in West Bengal, a very progressive state in a political sense. 24,000 crores, were it to be used properly, it would bring relief to millions and millions of people. And we suggest ways, and they will also be suggesting ways of improving the system and reforming the system. But they will tell you today of the loopholes in the system, the way in which the system is subverted, and also make suggestions for reform. I'm happy to see Devendra Sharma here also. He's come back from abroad and he's an expert on WTO and the agreement on agriculture and trade and so on. So he will give you his view on the entire WTO system. But it is practically a matter of great concern. And the reason is because the multinational grain corporations of America and Europe subsidize their farmers, as you were told yesterday, hugely, including Japan subsidizes its farmers hugely, much more, many times more than the Indian farmers are subsidized. As a result of which they are able to export grain to countries in Africa and perhaps Asia very cheaply. The intention is not altruistic. The intention is ultimately to take advantage, to destroy the production systems in the countries, destroy indigenous productions, capture the market, which is a huge market for grain. And once the market is captured, of course, prices will rise. But there is a huge controversy relating to the import of grain from the multinational corporations of America and Europe. It's a very intense debate. Devendra Sharma will take you through some of that debate. But I must tell you that about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe longer, through the multinational corporations in America, an NGO in India, CARE, began importing genetically modified grain without informing the recipients that they were actually doing so. Genetically modified food is again a huge controversy. India is eminently placed because of its organic production to capture a huge niche market in organic food and organic food production. The whole world, Europe and America, are turning towards organic food. Absence of pesticides is something people want. They don't want food with pesticides. You've seen the controversy over chilies, you've seen the controversy over turmeric being exported from India with pesticides, you've seen the controversy over tea being blacklisted abroad. Our fish has been blacklisted abroad because it had pesticides and so on. So increasingly in Europe, the markets are looking at organic food free of pesticides. And GM foods were imported surreptitiously into the country. Then there was a huge controversy, and then the NGO was forced to stop the import of grain. But it remains one of the debates of the future. Why should India import grain, genetically modified grain, when India has so much of its own production? And as you were told yesterday, we export some of our grain, organic grain, to countries in Eastern Europe, for example, which is then used for cattle feed and for pigs and so on and so forth. The customary vote of thanks. The Honorable Chief Justice Ray, Honorable Justices, ladies and gentlemen. For the last 2 years, while arguing the PUCL case in the Supreme Court, I have had a feeling, and it grew from year to year, that in this battle against malnutrition and hunger and starvation, the Supreme Court was unequal to the task. Powerful though it may be, committed though it may be, the forces of the bureaucracy, a huge bureaucracy, lethargic and lazy and corrupt, with the Supreme Court pressing and pressing and pressing, I could feel from adjournment to adjournment, from date to date, despite the complete commitment of the judges, that it was an unequal battle, a losing battle, that we were fighting and fighting and fighting, and we were standing in the same place. I know that if we had not done the case and the orders had not come, today the public distribution system would have been actually closed. I am absolutely certain, and if I do a review, and I remember Justice Kirpal asking me just before he retired, he said, what has been the effect of the case? And I told him, sir, we have prevented a downslide. We have been like a person holding up a stone on the mountainside, just preventing that stone from coming down. We have done that much. And he looked at me a little sad actually, because he was retiring and he had done such a tremendous effort. He had carried the case often without arguments. He had carried the case when we were uncertain. He had carried the case when our facts were not up to the mark and the government had flooded the court with data. He carried the case with the conviction that he had inside him. He carried the case, not really the lawyers or the petitioner and so on, and for justice. And at the end I told him, sir, we have just managed to stop the downslide. And that's been the situation. But I think, had it not been for the case today, the public distribution system would have been dismantled. Because there are people who feel that the 24,000 crores of the public distribution system is better spent on other commercial ventures rather than feeding the poor. And the midday meal scheme had almost come to an end when Justice Kirpal intervened, and after that, after his retirement, Justice Sabharwal intervened. Almost come to an end. And it took a lot of effort. There were so many recalcitrant states that just refused to obey the order of the Supreme Court till 2004. That is to say, 3 years of naked defiance till 2004. I have felt increasingly that the Supreme Court is very unequal to the task. And unless the High Courts really back the people of India in this daunting challenge, it is almost impossible to eradicate hunger, in a sense. In a theoretical sense, it's possible. Given the will, it's very possible. But the opposition is so powerful. And I felt that if the High Courts did not come in, and if our people, our activists, always looked at the Supreme Court and filed applications in the Supreme Court which were pending now, the Jharkhand applications were pending for 2.5, 3 years, other applications are pending for years, that nothing would happen. We would lose it. Over time, even the judges of the Supreme Court would get very tired and fatigued and say, now what can be done? It's natural, it's human nature to say, we've just gone into something that is too big for us. And that's why we felt that we needed to educate our activists in the High Courts to do state level problems and state level difficulties in the High Court and do things. I was very scared, as I told you when the conference started, I was very apprehensive that not a single thing should go wrong. Because I realized you've taken a big risk by coming here. You didn't know us. Some of you did. Many of you did not know who we were. We could have been anybody, but I think maybe the topic, the right to food, and your commitment carried you here. I was very apprehensive that not a single thing should take place. Not a single incident should take place which should cause you any embarrassment. And I think I can safely say that as you go, that you've had a decent meeting. And we have learned a lot from your interventions, and you have learned a lot, I think, from the speakers. Thank you very much, and have a safe journey back. Thank you very much, sir.